A reading from the letter of Paul to the Romans. Oh, the depth of the riches and wisdom and knowledge of God! How inscrutable are his judgments, and how unsearchable his ways! For who has known the mind of the Lord, or who has been his counselor? Or who has given the Lord anything, that he may be repaid? For from him, and through him, and for him are all things. To him be glory forever. Amen. The word of the Lord.
Our second reading for this Sunday comes from the letter of Paul to the Romans. We ended our reflection on the first reading from Isaiah with the question, how could human beings entrusted by God with authority over his people approximate the will of God? For if you have been put by God to rule God's people, God would expect you to implement his will. But as human beings, how can we read the mind of God? And that's precisely the point of the second reading. We are told that the ways of God, the will of God, the mind of God are all beyond our human capacity to penetrate, to scrutinize. There lies the first answer to our questions. We human beings should be humble in realizing that without God's own assistance, without God's own initiative to reveal to us himself, his mind, his design, his will, we cannot, by relying on our own efforts, enter the mind of God. St. Paul says it in a nice way. How deep are the riches and the wisdom and the knowledge of God! How inscrutable his judgments! How unsearchable his ways! And this is the attitude that is expected of an apostle. You know, St. Paul was already privileged to have such a deep mystical experience. The risen Lord appeared to him. How many of us would have such a blessing? Very few. And this is unique to the apostles. But even someone like Paul, who has had such a wonderful experience of the living Jesus, could say that the ways of God are inscrutable. We mere mortals, we who have not been privileged to receive such a blessing, should be more circumspect, should be more humble. We should not rush into saying, I know the mind of God. We are creatures reading the mind of the Creator. It is a mind that is really beyond our capacity to understand. So, we should marvel before the mind of God, especially those entrusted with authority in the church and over the people. We should always read the mind of God patiently, with the spirit of devotion and adoration, knowing that we could capture only a little, and we should rely on the grace of God. We should rely on God taking the initiative of drawing us into His mind, into His will. What comes to mind is the prayer of Solomon, a beautiful prayer, a prayer for wisdom. He said, "For I am a man short-lived and lacking in comprehension and of judgment." Lacking in comprehension of judgment and of laws. So, Solomon, like St. Paul, knowing the responsibility of being a ruler of God's people, of being an apostle of Jesus Christ, knows that they could not dispense of God's wisdom according to their likes and dislikes. They have to be faithful to the mind of God. But they have to be humble in prayer, in discernment, in adoration, so that they could have somehow a participation in this inscrutable wisdom of God. Let that be our prayer too for ourselves.